See, alright, so first and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakodash. We say, Domnus apostles and elders, agreements and ruler, teachers of apostles in truth. And we say salutations, so the Akim must push you with all truth and sincerity, day in and day out, and constantly in season on season, we say Shalom. And once again, going into a video here, and this basically touching upon this post that this person left here, right? And she said, if you're a Christian, a follower of, I read it as is, if you're a Christian, a follower of Christ, then the words of J, I know I wouldn't say that name, but the words of J, aka scripture, should be your final authority, not the words of men. This is just basic stuff. Now, what made me see this was, I mentioned it in a previous video before, that on my page itself, like on my Twitter page, it had one particular day that as my page started to pick up like Christians and Catholics debating, and they were debating so much that I started to show up basically every day, right? Now, this is a page I use for like news, so as you can see down here, I save things like for news and so forth and so on, right, to do videos upon, and that basically show up, and they said, you know what, some of the stuff that they was debating, I was to do videos upon, I did 1 or 2 videos on it, right? And so that is how these things show up, right? And this was something that what she said, Christians, they basically hold the words of the pastor above the words of the Lord, and we know really and truly we're supposed to obey who? We're supposed to obey God, we're supposed to obey God, right? That is written. But they obey man more than the Lord, right? They hold the words of the pastor more than they hold the scripture, the words of God, right? They obey the pastor more than they obey the Lord, right? Because we know at the end of the day, we know this, we call them Christian, but we know that they are the Antichrist. The Antichrist, right? Right? So let me just read what she said. She said again, let me read over. She said, if you're a Christian, a follower of Christ, then the words of J, aka scripture, should be your final authority, not the words of men. This is just basic stuff. Now let me jump to a scripture here. This is the book of Acts chapter 5, and I'll read from verse 26. It said, then when the captain with the officers and brought them without violence, for they feared the people, lest they should be stoned, lest they should have been stoned. And when they had brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest asked them, saying, did not we strictly command you that ye should not teach in this name? And behold, ye have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine, and intend to bring the man's blood upon us. Verse 29. Let's say, then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men. And that is what Peter and the other apostles said. We ought to obey God rather than men. But when it comes to these, these people that flood these churches, whether it be Christian churches, Catholic churches, Baptists, whatever it may be, they obey man more than they obey the Lord. So that is why you see when it comes to certain things that they might walk up to you on the streets, they will ask you a question, and you would go straight to the scripture and prove it, in the scriptures, and they would say all of a sudden, but my pastor never said that. That not written. Then they might tell you it's a white man book. There's go to the law of the law when they start to answer them from the scripture. So it goes to show that they obey the pastor more than they obey the Lord. But Peter and the apostles said what? Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, we ought to obey God rather than men, right? Because if they was obeying men, they would have never be outside the teaching, right? Right? If they obey what was told unto them from man. But no, Peter and them said what? We ought to obey God rather than men. And that is straight to the point. Right? We don't know, there is no truth in Christianity. They abide by the words of the pastor more than the words of the Lord. Again, just bringing up the reference, like on the streets when they walk up and thing, they hold the words of the pastor more than anything else. Right? That goes into like the next video I have to do, like this person talking about reading, because like there's something they don't do, they don't read. So when you do go into the scriptures and so forth, and you bring out certain things, they lost, And then they go hit you with some of the famous lines. The white man write that. Or that not written. Or my pastor say it and so. Right? That is why certain things like even like when they say God say don't judge. who they get that from? They get that from the pastor. You know? They say things like God love the sinner and all. God love the sinner is something along those lines. They say where they get that from. They get that from the pastor. So they obey the pastor more than they obey the Lord, right? Let's go to the book of Romans chapter 3. I read from verse 3. It says, for what if some did not believe? Shall the unbelief make the faith of God without effect? It says, God forbid. Yea, let God be true. Let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged. Right? So as I say here, say, let God be true, but every man a liar. But when you listen to these Christians and so forth, how they talk, the things that they ask and so forth, the things that they believe in, they make it seem like if God is a liar and man true. Right? We have heard things like, you hear them say, Paul, you hear Christians say all kind of madness, all kind of madness when it comes to the word of the Lord, blasphemous stuff as well, right? Some of the things they like to say. I remember someone telling me, a Christian telling me what that Timothy, her pastor above Timothy, right? Timothy are no truth, and that is where you get from them, right? Right? That's where you get from them. Let's go to the book of 2 Timothy. Alright, the next scripture I was looking for, 2 Timothy chapter 3. Go to verse 16. It says, all scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. And that is how important these scriptures is. Right? As I say, what? For all scripture is given by inspiration of God. Not the words of your pastor. Because a pastor, what a pastor do is he come and change everything that the Lord say. It's better he write his own book. the way how all of the pastors are. So let me just read some of the comments and you'll see. It said this belief is contrary to how Christians have historically lived out their faith. So this was some what the irony of who commented on biblical illiteracy is staggering. You could never read a letter of scripture and make it to heaven. Obviously today that seems like an absurd position, but considered actual history. The majority of people for most of Christian history were illiterate, having a Bible or 20 different translation or texts, a modern luxury foreign to Christianity. Owning a corpus of the size would be prohibitively expensive. What most modern Christians don't realize is that the liturgy, right, or liturgy was how the laity worship and learn their theology. There's all these big words and all these nonsense this person, going into, and it's basically stating what this person trying to prove is that you're supposed to listen to the theology. You're supposed to listen to a pastor above the word. And that goes to show, right? They say as much as we want to argue over theological matters, it is in the sacraments and the church that the faith is transmitted to the people. It always been this way, and it always will be this. You ain't even reading no more in that bullshit. You understand? But as the scriptures say, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction. And that is why we use the scriptures now to prove that the bullshit said is wrong. Right? According to the scriptures, the bullshit that he said is wrong. Right? Matthew chapter 15 verse let me read from verse Matthew chapter 15 verse 15 verse 7. It says, ye hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draw it nigh unto me with their mouth, and honoreth me with their lips, right? But their heart is far from me. But in vain they do worship me, teaching for the doctrines the commandments of men, right? And that is the thing. The commandments of men, that is what they follow, right? The commandments of men, they don't follow the commandments of the Lord. You know, and you see that with majority with these Christians and so forth. And we now read somebody that so now, you know, with her posting that, right? Now you said a CD debate. So people said, actually, who chose the books of the Bible? Scripture is words of men, although inspired. Hey. Todd Schaffer. I've seen this. I know I heard that name before already. You know, Todd Schaffer. Seen this person already, but can't remember for much. They say also men decide what was scripture and what was not scripture. It says scripture itself declares the church is a pillar of the foundation of the truth, which is wrong, right? Because their concept of the church is wrong. You know, and this says you see how much of them coming here, right? To tell her that, you know, that there will be man, there will be the pastor saints, you know, and that is where again Christianity. Again, there is no truth in those places. You know, there's a bunch of hypocrites, right? And you know, Jake go and flood these churches, you know, going every Sunday praying, fanning and dancing and all this sort of bullshit, where they are literally not following the words of the Lord. Right? So you say, but in vain do they worship me, teaching for the doctrines, the commandments of men. Right? Let me go to the book of this is the book of Isaiah chapter 29 verse 13. Right? It says, wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw near me, and that's references the Matthew that I now read. It says, wherefore the Lord said, for as much as this people draw me with their mouth and with their lips to honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. So it goes to show how they fear man more than they fear the Lord. You understand? And they hold to the words of man more than they obey the words of the Lord. And that, again, that is what you will get in Christianity. That is why when I ask them a question, they always tell you the things out of their mouth, never going to the word, you know, or it's going contrary to what is, right? Right? Now again, we're supposed to obey the words of the Lord, not to obey man, right? Or the things that they be saying, right? But again, in Christianity, in these Catholic churches, yeah, there will be the bishop, the pastor, the pope, or whoever it may be, more than the words of the Lord. And that's contrary to the word, right? So hey, with that, once again, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yoshai, Ba'ashem Kakadash. We said that the apostle and elders agree most on Ruah teaches the apostle and shoot. And we see salutations, so they are must push with no truth and sincerity, day in and day out, and constantly in season and season. We say Shalom.